Dragons are an integral component of the lore of Elden Ring, particularly their connections to the Crucible and the Elden Ring itself. Gifted with great power and reported immortality, the ancient dragons have influenced the lands between in profound ways. One of these influences was the formation of the ancient dragon cult in Leyndell, born out of the friendship between the ancient dragon Fortisax and the son of Marika, Godwyn the Golden. While the timeline for the events in Elden Ring is still a bit murky, we do know that the Shattering was centuries prior to the start of the narrative, which explains the decayed and broken state the lands between is in. As the Shattering was centuries prior to the story of the game, we know that the ancient dragon cult was also formed centuries prior to the game's narrative as well. This isn't all that surprising considering the general lack of ancient dragons in the wild, and the prominence of modern dragons that have reduced size and power in comparison to the ancient dragons. Though, before I go further, I wanted to express my regret for failing to demonstrate the distinction between the ancient dragon cult and those who partake in dragon communion, as they are not the same. I used them almost interchangeably in my previous video, and I wanted to make this video to discuss the lore surrounding the cult and the act of communion, in an effort to correct some statements I made previously. Alright, let's jump into it. The creation of the ancient dragon cult is such a fascinating tale, as bitter combatants become inseparable comrades and create a union between humanoids and dragons. During the War of the Ancient Dragons, Fortisax and Godwyn fought one another, and through a long and arduous battle, the two would ultimately become lifetime friends and comrades, despite each of them representing different sides of the war. Yet, the friendship lasted, and Fortisax gifted Godwyn the knowledge of golden lightning, befitting the Golden Order. Moreover, from this friendship sprang the ancient dragon cult once the war ended, and through this Leyndell knights and warriors began accessing the power of the dragons. The cult had a clear respect for the dragons, and we know of at least one cult priestess who was a dragon. This dragon was Lanciax, the brother to Fortisax, and interestingly, could take on a humanoid form, an ability that likely led to easier communication between dragons and humans within the cult, in relationship with the Round Table Knight Vike. Though if you want to hear a bit more about that topic, I'd suggest checking out my previous video on Draconic hybrids. So, what else do we know about the ancient dragon cult? Well, we know that they respected and revered the power of the ancient dragons and actually did not partake in dragon communion. Hence there being separate sacred seal items, namely the Gravelstone Seal and Dragon Communion Seal. The Gravelstone Seal boosts the power of dragon cult incantations specifically, and scales with faith. The Dragon Communion Seal, on the other hand, boosts dragon communion incantations specifically. Interestingly enough, it scales with both faith and arcane, though more so with arcane, demonstrating their departure from the path of both the dragon cult and the Golden Order, since arcane magic is heavily frowned upon, as it is not the magic of the gods. Thus, the act of dragon communion and being in the ancient dragon cult are not synonymous, and dragon communion is seen as heretical to the tenets of the ancient dragon cult. Moreover, a primary difference between dragon cult incantations and dragon communion incantations is the nature of the abilities themselves, as dragon cult incantations are all lightning-based, whereas the dragon communion incantations are mostly breath-based, with a claw and maw attack as well. This distinction is pertinent, as it highlights how different the goals and abilities of each faction are, as dragon cult members seek the lightning-based powers of dragon, whereas those partaking in dragon communion want access to all attributes and abilities of the dragons. It seems as though they wanted to become dragons themselves through any means. However, if you've seen my Draconic Hybrids video, then you know I believe a theme of Elden Ring is the incompatibility of humans and dragons, with dragon communion being one example of this. If one commits the heretical act of dragon communion and consumes enough dragon hearts, they are eventually transformed into grotesque lesser dragons that have access to few of the abilities or attributes the ancient dragons, or even most modern dragons, have. Magma worms serve as examples of what happens when a human attempts to take on all the power of a dragon. They lose their humanity, they cannot fly, and they don't gain access to lightning. Now, to pivot just a bit, where did Draconic Tree Sentinels fit into all of this? Were they members of the dragon cult, or were they heretics who partook in dragon communion and have not yet become magma worms? Feels as though this question would be easier to answer if we could see what Draconic Tree Sentinels look like under the armor. Though all we can really go off of is that the Draconic Tree Sentinels were sentinels that believed the only way to protect the Erd Tree was to become dragons themselves. Given that description, it implies that they partook in dragon communion, though aside from their horses breathing fire, they don't actually use dragon communion powers. To speculate for a moment, I wonder if the Sentinels fed their horses dragon hearts, hence why they have fire breath, and the Sentinels themselves somehow got a hold of the ancient dragon prayer book, a tome that supposedly never reached the lands between. I certainly don't have all the pieces to concretely say this idea is canon. However, I can't really think of another way that the Draconic Tree Sentinels can have the abilities they have. As the only known member of the dragon cult to wield red lightning was Vike, and it wasn't an ability, he was specifically gifted by the ancient dragon Lanciax. So, perhaps the Sentinels were able to obtain red lightning through deals with ancient dragons. And this could help explain the presence of a Draconic Tree Sentinel in Far Missoula, the location of the ancient dragon prayer book that contains red lightning incantations. It's fascinating to me how Draconic Tree Sentinels don't really seem to fit as members of the dragon cult given their proclivity toward red lightning, nor do they appear to be those partaking in dragon communion, as they don't use any dragon communion abilities. I really like to think that we also can't see the Sentinels under their armor, because it has been fused to them through their use of red lightning, and that feeding dragon hearts to their horses and riding them symbolically made them dragons, as they could breathe fire and wield red lightning. Now, let's make another pivot and discuss a few more things relating to the cult and communion. An interesting distinction between the cult and the act of communion is the effects they have on the tarnished. The dragon cult incantations actually offer no change in the player's physical appearance. However, consuming dragon hearts and obtaining more dragon communion incantations leads the player to having eyes of a dragon, a clear first step into becoming a magma worm if that path continues to be followed. The reason I find this detail so interesting is not only because it once again highlights how different the goals of each faction were, but it also raises even more questions about Draconic Tree Sentinels, as we are not able to see if they themselves have draconic features, similar to their horses. If they have draconic features, it's fairly safe to say they were eating dragon hearts. Though if they lack draconic features, they may simply have learned red lightning through the dragon cult or from traveling to Far Missoula. Though, more realistically, the dragon great claw that the Draconic Tree Sentinels wield simply may give them access to red lightning incantations. As its description says, it is enwreathed with lightning, and the tooth does appear to dictate when the lightning attacks begin. Regardless, it's still fun to speculate on, and I'm still fascinated that horses have draconic features at all. So, the dragon cult was vehemently against dragon communion, and when I think about it, it makes a lot of sense that this was a major political problem for the Golden Order, as they had already waged a war with the dragons and likely did not wish to do so again. Thus, those who partook in dragon communion were effectively going against the wishes of the Golden Order, and were actively reducing the dragon population, and almost certainly raising tensions between the Golden Order and remaining dragons. The act of dragon communion was an affront to the relationship that leyndell had established with the ancient dragons. Yet some were so thirsty for the power of the dragons they led themselves down paths of ruin, actively fighting against both dragons and the Golden Order. And when it comes to Draconic Tree Sentinels, it's honestly quite unclear how much, if any, dragon communion they have participated in, as they have red lightning due to their weapons, though I don't think that's the whole story. Regardless, I think one concept holds true across this video and my previous one. Humans and dragons are incompatible creatures, whether it be politically or biologically. Humans attempting to replicate the powers of dragons will themselves become grotesque imitations of dragons, and those in the dragon cult gained abilities that are ultimately weak imitations of red lightning, as they never received the ancient dragon prayer book. Moreover, the relationship between humans and dragons remained tense even after the war, and those that partook in dragon communion and constructed churches for it likely only influenced the breakdown of human and dragon relations leading up to the shattering. Humans have long strived for the power of the ancient dragons. However, it's a power they are not capable of controlling. Thank you so much for watching until the end. I really appreciate it. Sorry if this one came a bit out of left field, but I really wanted to discuss these topics more and let everyone know that I do in fact know the difference between the cult and the act of communion. Anyways, though, I hope you enjoyed it, and my apologies for the delays between uploads, though I am hoping to soon have a more consistent schedule for all of you. Well, with all that said, I've been Noctugal, and I will see you in the next one.